Hey everyone, welcome to Clickheads. I'm Eddie the Chump, and today we're going to be talking about Valorant, the bootcamp, and our general impressions of the game. Now, first things first, a huge thank you to everyone at Riot who made this possible. Every dev we spoke to really understood the audience that this game is aimed at, and answered all the questions we had with honesty, good humour, and some serious BDE. A wonderfully refreshing approach, I can tell you. So with that out of the way, I guess the first thing you guys really want to know is, what is Valorant actually like to play? Well, to answer that, I'll talk about what I think is the most direct comparison to the game, and that's CSGO. In preparation for playing Valorant, I had been DMing, playing Faceit matches, and reintroducing myself to the mechanics of Counter-Strike, as I had an inkling that that was going to pay off. And sure enough, that was true. Valorant really feels like an updated and unique meditation on Counter-Strike and its format. I have thousands of hours in CS, but I will admit that was a long time ago, like 4 years ago, so getting reacquainted with the specifics of how tac shooters work still took some adjustment. Before I go any further, I want to make what I think is a reasonable generalization. Valorant is not a game for people who just want to run around fragging in a casual way. Everything about it has been designed to be hardcore, and if you're approaching it with the attitude of, let's just mess around, the game will punish you severely. This is a game for people who want to get good at it. It rewards mastery, and the skill gap a player can generate between themselves and their opponents is vast. If you're familiar with Counter-Strike, this will be music to your ears, I'm sure, and I'll go through what will immediately be familiar to you once you jump in. The format of bomb defusal is, in my mind, the most compelling FPS scenario around at the moment, and Valorant features a first to 13 round game that switches sides at the half. I enjoy this mode, obviously, and concepts like pistol rounds, half buys, saving, and full buys felt very natural in this game. The game flows like a CS player would assume, and the economy system is very easy to pass, even if you've never played it before. Generally, if you're saving or half buying, you don't want to spend downwards past 2k, as that will allow you to full buy next round with the round bonus. Speaking of which, Valorant is actually a lot clearer in terms of economy management than Counter-Strike is. You know how much you and your opponents will get as a round bonus, win or lose, and it becomes quite natural for all players to start predicting when their opponents have money or not, influencing your purchases. The game tells you in the bottom right how much credit you are getting for every kill mid-round, so you can understand what you personally are earning throughout a game, which is a great touch. Speaking of purchases, let's talk about the weapons and the abilities. In my experience, the weapon archetypes are very well organised and easy to understand. For a CS AK, read the Valorant Vandal. For an AWP, read the OP, etc, etc. But unlike CS, most guns can ADS, and with that brings my first pleasant surprise. If you know anything about competitive CS, you will know that currently the Krieg is dominating that game. It's a terrorist side rifle that fires faster than the AK, does more damage, and has better wall penetration, and has a scope. With almost every gun in Valorant being able to scope, I was worried that the gameplay might collapse into some Krieg-like nightmare. But it doesn't, and that's because when ADSing, a lot of the guns have altered behaviour. The Vandal, for example, has a slowed rate of fire when aiming down sight. The Bulldog becomes a burst, as does one of the SMGs. ADSing in Valorant has been designed to be a tactical trade-off, not an insta-advantage button, and personally, I found myself playing with a Vandal decidedly not aiming down sight while peeking unless at extreme range. The player is empowered to make these trade-off decisions, not be subject to some smothering forced meta. Speaking of meta, I asked a dev a question about how the guns were tuned, because a lot of them feel more viable than their CS equivalents in more scenarios, the SMGs and the shotguns particularly. Their answer reflected a wider philosophy. Yes, the cheaper guns are balanced to be sharper, as in, when in their correct range and context, they really are viable, but they're not meant to compete with full buy rifles on a full buy round in a general sense. They're supposed to be a gamble, something you can use to force buy and play into their respective strengths to reset your opponents or catch them off guard. Now, as a side note, and something I'll get into later, because of the agent's own unique kits, there are perhaps ways for players to generate more of those specific engagements than would occur naturally in Counter-Strike, like getting up close or lurking through your own smokes. This is a really fun part of the game, and I will cover this in greater detail later, but suffice to say, it's rare to have a weapon in your hand and not know what to do with it. My general impressions of the economy and weapons was, this feels familiar enough to instantly get a grip, but new enough to explore and experiment. The perfect scenario. So let's finish this topic off with a little conversation about weapon mechanics. Just like Counter-Strike, various weapons have different mobility effectiveness. Do not start running and shooting with the Vandal, as an example, it won't be accurate. The reason I play with the crosshair I do is because while learning, I like to see visual feedback about when I'll be accurate and when I won't. It's training wheels essentially, and until it becomes second nature to me, I find this constructive. Another thing to understand is that weapon damage fall-off is a real thing in Valorant. You might be used to the AK killing in one shot to the head in CS from across the map, but in Valorant, there are ranges where this isn't the case. All weapons, in fact, will tell you in the buy menu how they behave and what wall penetration value they have, which is good to know because Valorant feels much more like CS Source than CSGO in terms of wall penetration. There are many points on a map where wall banging is not only viable, but preferred. These spots will catch you out, I'm sure, against experienced players until you learn that knowledge too, which is another system to master. But by far the biggest when it comes to weapons is how the recoil works. At the start of a spray, every gun does have fixed recoil, but at a certain point, it will begin to introduce random deviation. What this means is that spraying isn't always how you should be shooting, and this is by design. Devs talked at length about how they wanted fire discipline and how you choose to shoot to be situational. Therefore, the mastery of shooting is different than just learning a pattern and always full autoing. Some of you I know won't like this, but when playing Valorant, it became second nature to me pretty quickly. It's one of those things that sounds really bad if you're coming from other games, and I initially felt this way too, but it doesn't play out that way. Just learn what works best in which situation, and you'll do that naturally as you play. I actually like Valorant's recoil system now, although there were a few painful sprays that hit absolutely nothing along the way. Now moving on, I'm going to talk about the agents and their abilities, which for sure is where Valorant really wants to separate itself from games that have come before in this genre. Fans of Rainbow Six or Overwatch will instantly feel at home here. To those players, unique agent kits is something that appeals, and for myself, it was the most intriguing part of the game. First things first, the abilities do not dominate gunplay. It's very difficult to think of even one ability that would even vaguely qualify as a win button. Some are very strong, but not for the reasons that you might think. Phoenix and Breach have flashes, a lot of heroes have some variant of a smoke, or walls for controlling space, and there's only really one stun in the game, which to me at least is pretty balanced as it's not exactly subtle. It can be fired through walls, but there are outplay options, which is a common theme. Every ability or signature move can be outplayed, and 99% of those abilities in the game function like utility that can be found in Counter-Strike already. There are a couple of exceptions, and when the Sova teaser was released, a lot of people were really worried about wall hacks being in the game in any form. You'll be pleased to hear then that all the wall hack abilities in the game are impactful for sure, but not in any way game-breaking. Sova's recon arrow looks really strong to the uninitiated, but in play experience, it's really easy to outplay. First of all, you can destroy it. So if it's not placed well, the info value you can get from it can be very minimal. And secondly, it has limited range, and you as the opponent have visual feedback in where it's scanning and for how long. It can also be line of sighted, so even if you're within that radius, if the bolt actually cannot see you, you will not show up to your opponents. This is very typical, and I want to reassure you guys, if you're more gunplay centric, the agents and their kits do not get in the way of that. They truly do enhance the proceedings and not overshadow them. I have a few minor concerns in that certain heroes are approaching must picks, particularly Sage, Breach and Brimstone. Their utility is just very applicable, so they get played often, and I will say Sage is very, very strong. Her wall and slow orbs mean that on defensive duty, she can just shut down an entire lane by herself. The wall in particular takes a lot of punishment to break, and when you combine this with very short feeling rotation pathing, the power of that is increased. This is obviously tunable, and I did hear noise of the devs tuning it after feedback, but it's certainly not game breaking. But the best part of the agents is that they really cater to how you want to play the game. For example, I instantly gravitated towards Phoenix, Breach and Sova. This is because I either like to hard entry with Phoenix, play support to flash an entry in and trade, say with Breach, or sit back and play quite mobile in sight on defense with Sova. These agents and their kits really enable and empower me to play the game how I want. Flashing yourself in with Phoenix is harder than I assumed. The angles at which the flash travels and pops take some getting used to. You absolutely will flash yourself a lot when learning him, just a word of caution. But once you get used to it, it's pretty straightforward. Phoenix's ult is also top tier. You basically get a free peek and then respawn at the place you activated from. Super entry fragging initiated. Even if you die from, say, an off angle, when you respawn, you have that info of where that player was, which is just killer. His molly also heals himself, as does his wall, and I was of the mind that healing would be irrelevant in a game like this, but it's not actually. Because of the way that armor works, it's just more health essentially. Entering and getting a kill but being low now has a solution. Choosing the right agent for how you personally want to play the game is really the core of the Valorant experience, and for sure the natural tendency will be to specialise, but if someone takes your preferred number one choice, there is always another option. I like to be aggressive, so my hero pool reflects that. However, if you're more defensively minded, there are multiple options. Sage and Cypher really empower slower, more deliberate playstyles, and what the agents effectively do is almost create a role queue scenario for tac shooters. This is a massive boon for the game, in my opinion, and certainly where a lot of the depth and replayability will come from. If you were worried about the power level of the abilities in the game, I can reassure you, clicking heads is always the most important factor at play. You can set up all the traps you like, Cypher, but if someone is just mechanically better than you, it will take its toll in the long run. As it should. And I say that as someone who isn't that great, but in this game, skill really does come first, and Valorant encourages you at every turn to get good. There is one area that might catch you off guard when you play the game, and that's how cheap the abilities are in the economy. It's the same in CS, of course, but I feel that almost every round in Valorant has some serious utility being used, and that's not a bad thing. Using the abilities properly can overturn an economic and weapon disadvantage quite readily if you're smart and bold enough. Now this is true in CS as well, with a pop flash pistol rush with large numbers of players capable of ruining a team on a full buy in that game too. But at first, when you do play, the fact that agents have their signature ability at the very least every single round might catch you off guard. You soon get used to this though, and get adjusted to the ways in which Valorant is not in fact a CS clone. I thoroughly enjoyed this part of the game. I think many of you with concerns will be pleasantly surprised when you actually get to play. Now finally I'm going to talk about the maps a little bit. There were two maps in the bootcamp build, Haven, which is the 3 bomb site one, and Bind, which has the teleporters. Haven was my favourite, and the 3 bomb sites really didn't pan out how I was expecting it to. And I say that in a positive way. I thought when I saw the map that defending would be very difficult, because you're naturally more spread out than you would be in a typical Counter-Strike map. But what ended up happening was, yes, it might be easier for attackers to get the bomb down on Haven, but post-plant, the defenders have a lot of power in their hands for retake. The meta quickly settled into, if you're being pressured on a site, run away and keep your utility. This is because, like I mentioned earlier, the defensive rotations feel shorter in Valorant maps than CS maps, meaning it's more efficient to stay alive and play for post-plant than it is to try and stay and fight. This isn't always true, obviously, but that's the rule of thumb I tried to play with, and it started to make sense the more I played. Bind at first was a little bit confusing to me because of the teleporters, which do offer attacking and defensive rotation options, but because they're one way and make a very audible noise whenever they're used, they're also a bit obvious. I will say that Bind definitely felt more set play orientated, with say Brimstone really coming into his own on attack, whereas Haven felt a bit more scrimmy and aim duel focused. They're both great, but I had more of a fun time on Haven as it felt more instantly accessible. If you're a strong AWP player, you will love defending on Bind. I'll just leave it at that. Now I would normally end this video with some criticism or concerns, but in all honesty I don't really have any besides a few small tweaks. Viper's ult is really good, as is Sova's, Breach's, Phoenix, and a few more. Sage's wall is pretty standout. The Guardian's single shot rifle feels outrageous in a skilled player's hands, but it should feel that way. There's really nothing that feels like, whoa, that's way too much. In truth, the only concern I have is not with the game, but with the players excited to try it. Valorant is hard, its shooting mechanics are difficult, the ability's situational, its economy punishing if you don't learn it. It's just a hardcore FPS that is certainly my cup of tea, but what about players who might come from other games with easier abilities and mechanics that offer a lot of power? Well, as a dev said to me in much kinder words, if you're that kind of player, it's time to get good. This game does not coddle or patronize you, your value is 110% linked to your skill and game knowledge. Until you develop those and gain increasing mastery, you won't be rewarded. And I couldn't be happier for that, even as someone who will not be amongst the best or anywhere near that. And all that, dear viewer, is my general impressions of Valorant. As a fan of Counter-Strike who was lucky enough to be included in the bootcamp, I think you can read a lot into the fact that I can't wait to play again. And that's about all I want to talk about today. Let me know what you think of all this and how I've broken it down in the comment section down below. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you like the content on this channel, please hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you get notified when we upload. Until next time!